The Rockefeller family was instrumental in funding and promoting eugenics, both in America and overseas. The Rockefellers helped fund the Eugenics Record Office. The founding director of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, William Welch, sat on the ERO's board and helped direct its activities. The Rockefellers sponsored the studies of the eugenics researchers at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes in Germany, including Ernst Rudin, who would go on to draft Nazi Germany's forced sterilization law. And, when the American Eugenics Society became embarrassed of its own name, its longtime director, Frederick Osborne, merely took over as president of the Rockefeller-founded Population Council. A chapter of his 2009 book, Showing Up for Life, called Walking with Giants, he writes admiringly of the Rockefellers and their influence in the field. Every corner we've turned in the field of global health, we've found that the Rockefellers were already there and had been there for years. When we committed to childhood immunization, we found ourselves building on efforts the Rockefeller Foundation had helped launch and fund in the 1980s. When we became interested in fighting malaria and tuberculosis, we learned that the Rockefellers had been studying the prevention and treatment of such diseases around the globe for, in some cases, as long as 100 years. A similar dynamic held true in the case of HIV/AIDS. A lesson we learned from studying and working with the Rockefellers is that to succeed in pursuing audacious goals, you need like-minded partners with whom to collaborate. And we learned that such goals are not prizes claimed by the short-winded. The Rockefellers stay with tough problems for generations. As Gates Sr. suggests, it is by working with like-minded partners that such great achievements in the field of global health can be made. For the Gates, these like-minded partners include the Rockefellers themselves. Bill Gates Sr. got to discuss global health, agriculture, and environment with the likes of David Rockefeller Sr. and David Rockefeller Jr. at a meeting on Philanthropy in a Global Century at Rockefeller University campus in 2000. And Bill Gates, as we have seen, co-hosted a meeting on reducing the population with David Rockefeller in 2009.
The Kissinger-authored U.S. plan targeted 13 key countries where massive population reduction was called for. Kissinger recommended that IMF and World Bank loans be given on condition that nations initiate aggressive population control programs, such as sterilization. Kissinger also recommended that food be used as a weapon, and that instigating wars was also a helpful tool in reducing population.
Controls the food supply controls the people. Who controls the energy can control whole continents. Who controls money can control the world.
Kissinger, secretario de Estado del presidente Nixon, eleva un informe al presidente de los Estados Unidos que se denominó, les pido a los señores senadores que me escuchen, implicancias del crecimiento poblacional para la seguridad de los Estados Unidos y sus intereses de ultramar. Implicancias del crecimiento poblacional para la seguridad de los Estados Unidos y sus intereses de ultramar, más conocido como informe Kissinger o Memorándum 200. Es un informe grande de 200 hojas. Yo he dado muchos años clase con ese informe y he participado de su lectura en el Congreso de la Nación en la Convención Constituyente de 1994. En ese informe dice que durante el siglo XXI los Estados Unidos de América carecerán de los recursos minerales necesarios para su industria y que esos recursos yacen inexplotados en los países en vías de desarrollo. Que si esos países alcanzan un crecimiento poblacional importante, será inevitable su desarrollo industrial, desarrollo que debemos evitar a toda costa para que esos países no consuman los minerales necesarios para los Estados Unidos de América. Páginas más adelante dice, debemos exterminar el genio joven de los países con alto índice de natalidad que pudieran oponerse a la explotación extranjera. Y más adelante, debemos insistir en los problemas para la salud que pudieran ocasionar los embarazos y los partos. Y en las páginas finales hay muchos más párrafos clarificadores terribles. Por ejemplo, no debemos más presentar como control de natalidad, sino como derechos, lo aclara ampliamente Henry Kissinger. Y al final dice, lógicamente, para que los países anfitriones de estas políticas no sospechen, debemos ocultar nuestros objetivos demográficos detrás de planes sanitarios. En ese momento se le da forma legislativa por un Congreso de Médicos Parlamentarios a las 4 leyes que ya fueron legisladas en nuestro país y en todos los países de Sudamérica y prácticamente en todos los países dominados del hemisferio sur.
Wrote with very little disapproval about using forced sterilization for population control.
In the event that I am reincarnated, I would like to return as a deadly virus in order to contribute something to solve overpopulation.
Αν και μπορεί να εκλειφθεί ως ασήμαντη δήλωση, ας θυμηθούμε τι είπε ο πρόσφατα εκλείπων πρίγκιπας Φίλιππος του Εδιμβούργου. Στην περίπτωση που μετενσαρκωθώ, θα ήθελα να επιστρέψω ως θανατηφόρος ιός ή δολοφόνος, για να συνεισφέρω κάτι στην επίλυση του παγκόσμιου υπερπληθυσμού.
So far, globally, we are so far above the population and the consumption levels which can be supported by this planet that I know in one way or another it's going to come back down. So I don't hope to avoid that. I hope that it can occur in a civil way, and I mean civil in a special way, peaceful. The planet can support something like 1 billion people, maybe 2 billion, depending on how much liberty and how much material consumption you want to have. If you want more liberty and more consumption, you have to have fewer people. And conversely, you can have more people. I mean, we could even have 8 or 9 billion probably if we have a very strong dictatorship, which is smart. It's, unfortunately, you never have smart dictatorships. They're always stupid. So, but if you had a smart dictatorship and a low standard of living, you can have it. But we want to have freedom and we want to have a high sentence. So we're going to have 1 billion people. And we're now at 7. So we have to get back down. I hope that this can be slow, relatively slow, and that it can be done in a way which is relatively equal, so that people share the experience and you don't have a few rich, trying to force everybody else to deal with it. So those are my hopes. I mean, these are pretty pessimistic hopes,
And so there are these 3 grim, well, 4 actually, 4 grim things we have to cope with. We have to try and mitigate. We need to eat less meat. We need to stop land being used for cattle and growing grain for the billions of animals that we keep in our intensive farms. And we need to eliminate corruption. That's something for the politicians, not me. Hide away from human population growth. Because it underlies so many of the other problems. All these things we talk about wouldn't be a problem if there was the size of population that there was 500 years ago. Hide away from human population growth. Because, it underlies so many of the other problems. All these things we talk about wouldn't be a problem if there was the size of population that there was 500 years ago.
So in the session we just attended here at the Economic Forum, I think there was a sense of relief, actually, in your frankness. You brought up some issues that others are reluctant to bring up.
Always. All the religious groups are against me because I'm talking about population. They want more souls. I want less on the planet.
The Earth is overpopulated, so refraining from having a child is a legitimate right choice. In my opinion, I'm pro-natalist. I have 3 children myself, and I think that contemporary birth rates endanger Western style of life. What's your take on it?
So, first of all, at the time of the agricultural revolution, there were something like 8 million people on the earth. Now there are 8 billion. We don't have a shortage of people. If it stays 8 billion, if it goes down to 5 billion, it's fine. There are enough humans on earth. So I'm not afraid that the humankind will disappear because there are enough people who want to have children. Again, personally, I can't even say that I chose not to have kids. It never even occurred to me to have kids, really. It's like...
Holdren is the resident science czar of the Obama White House. Holdren says that the optimum world population is 1 billion. The implications of his belief structure and his world outlook are genocide. This is a book called Ecoscience. This is a cookbook for the extermination of humanity. To provide a high quality of life for all, there must be fewer people, says Holdren. He says you could do this by putting chemicals in food and water. He wants to have licenses for birth. What happens to people that are born illegitimately, meaning without a birth permit? Compulsory abortion. Think about that. He even writes about infanticide. In order to enforce this, he talks about a supranational monstrosity that he calls a planetary regime. This means a world empire, a supranational, one-world government that would attempt to control all details of human life. This is an ultra-Hitlerian genocidalist who's today operating out of the White House in Washington, D.C., and it's time to kick him out.
Back into the history of it, and I came accidentally upon a book by Dr. Lily Kay. She was doing a research project looking at the origins of molecular biology in the United States. And that was primarily my interest, was just reviewing the history of molecular biology. But to my surprise, much of the book describes what was called the Science of Man project by the Rockefeller Foundation. And primarily, and this is in the period about 1910, primarily what he was interested in, and his foundation board, was doing social engineering. They were concerned that society was made of a lot of people they considered undesirables. Their definition of undesirables was people that had lower IQ, people that had physical defects, people who had diseases, people who did not behave in a way that these group of elitists thought people should behave in a society. So their idea was to use eugenics, which was the primary science at the time, to redevelop man, to create a new type of person. And they coined the term social engineering. Now, of course, at that time, we didn't have DNA as a concept. So they were using rather crude genetics to bring this about in the very beginning. So what she shows is the Rockefeller Foundation was really putting a lot of money in this. And in order to do that, he thought, what I'll do is I will fund major universities. And he picked Caltech as one of those universities, and then some in the East like Harvard and Johns Hopkins and Columbia, University of Chicago as the primary centers where this type of study would be carried out and how to re-engineer human beings to be in the form that they thought humans should be. And gradually, as science began to become more sophisticated, and eugenics began to get a really bad name as the period of Adolf Hitler occurred, and you realize that the Rockefeller eugenicists, before Hitler became well known in power, they were traveling to Germany and exchanging information on these eugenic programs. So a fair amount of this information came from the Rockefeller Foundation. Of course, after World War II, when the world found out a lot of what was going on in eugenics and the horror of eugenics, most of these programs were abandoned, and the Rockefeller Foundations very quickly said to all their members, let's never use the name eugenics anymore. What we'll talk about is social engineering, the new science of man, behavioralism. So they had these key words that meant basically the same type idea, that is redesigning man and man's behavior and controlling it through elitist ideas, but we would do it through new science. And we would establish major institutions in the United States that would control medical education through his General Education Board, which was a very powerful foundation regulation of education in America. And so he would appoint professors that would be directors of these programs. He groomed people who believed, like he did, that in fact man should be redesigned. We need this science of man to re-engineer human beings, but do it in a more scientific way than this crude eugenics program that he began with. And what that necessitated was using what was called molecular biology. Well, with the discovery of DNA, this became more sophisticated, and that you could manipulate certain genes and change how the brain functioned. And of course, then they got into the neuroscience field itself and began to look at, well, how does the brain work? How can we change behavior by altering brain function? And this has led up to the present day when we have things like the decade of the brain, where there's intense study of the behavioral functions of the brain and how it works. That is, we're going to recreate man in our image, what we think man should be, how people should think, what they should think, the limitations on their behavior. It's a true scientific social engineering of human beings. Well, leading from that, when we start looking at, well, look at some of the programs that have sort of spurred out of this, you know, the high-tech DNA manipulation, brain manipulation through electrodes or through transmission outside of electrodes to change human thinking. These are the more sophisticated programs that are a little bit more obvious, but then there's things that are less obvious. For instance, fluoridating water.